In this video, I'm going to cover one of the more advanced features of ProFlares, dynamic triggering. Dynamic triggering allows you to change the brightness and scale of a flare based on its position on screen, whether it be the edge of the screen or the center of it. Here's another example of dynamic triggering. This is one of the example flares, and you can see I can move it around the screen. But where the dynamic triggering really comes into play is as the flare moves off the screen. So as I slowly move it off, you can see that you've got these big shafts of light that come in from the edge. It's a really cool effect and really simple to set up. Alright, let's have a look at the flare settings. Alright, I've got the flare selected. If I open the dynamic triggering settings, I can see all the global settings for dynamic triggering. I'm going to turn them all off for now to go through each one. So you can see as I turn off the edge boost, we no longer get any kind of brightness boost when we get towards the edge. Turn it back on and I get quite close to the edge so we can see what's going on. The first setting you'll notice is the dynamic edge scale. Basically what this does is it adds scale to every element within the flare as it gets close to the edge. So if I crank this up really high and move the flare away from this edge, you can see it returns to its normal scale value, and move it back towards it, really extreme, it gets massive. Alright, so I'm just going to scale this back down so we can have a look at the next setting. Maybe about there. So the next one is dynamic edge brightness, and this is a little bit more sensitive, so I'm just going to type in values. Basically what this does is it adds brightness to the flare as it reaches the edge, so you can really boost up the brightness of the flare. This works great if you combine it with the flare getting bigger using the scale at the same time. One thing to note, these values aren't multiplication, they're added to the original value. So if I was to put in a negative number in, say, the scale, I can reduce the flare's scale as it gets towards the edge. You can see it now scales down. This comes in useful later on. The next three settings define the region around the edge of the screen that triggers the dynamic edge boost. Edge range defines the size of the region around the edge of the screen. So if I was to pump this up to a higher value, you can see that even though my flare isn't quite at the edge of the screen, it'll already start being affected by it. Still being the maximum when it gets to the edge of the screen. The edge bias and the edge curve allow you to do fine-grained control over the region around the edge of the screen. You can also have the flare affected when it reaches the center of the screen. So if I was to drag up and increase the center scale, as at the moment the flare isn't within the center region of the screen, but as it does, you'll notice as soon as it does, flare increases with scale. We can also do the same for brightness, so we can have this brightness scale up. So this is extremely exaggerated effect, but you get the idea. And again, we can increase the center range so that the flare gets affected earlier. If you had a keen eye, you may have already noticed that a number of our flare elements are not getting affected in the same way as the global settings. For instance, so if I was to drag the flare off to the edge and then change the edge scale, you'll also notice that these iris elements aren't getting any bigger. Each of the elements for flare can override the global settings for the dynamic triggering. You can find these on every element if you click edit and then go to the override options, and then you'll have the 4 corresponding options. You can use all or none of these, or anything in between. So for this particular element, there's this multi-iris. The scale's not being affected by the edge because it's set to 0. So if I was to turn that off and have the true global settings, you can see that that's getting increased in size massively. Where this is also useful is when an element reaches the center of the screen. So as I drag this into the center, I'll just reduce the dynamic center scale and the global settings. You'll also notice that this multi-iris is fading out as it reaches the center. And I'll just turn off the dynamic center boost to show you why this is useful. So I've just turned that off. You'll notice as these get quite close to the center, they kind of do a strange sort of just looks a little bit unnatural. So what we can do is turn the edge center boost on and also reduce its brightness as it comes towards the center of the screen, and this just fades it off just in time so you don't have that same effect. And when you combine that with the other elements getting larger at the same time, it creates quite a convincing effect. So at the start of the video I showed you this lens flare and how as it goes off the screen you get these large shaft of lights. And how to set this style of effect up is I have two additional lens flare elements, only a single one, so there's nothing too fancy going on. So if I turn them off, you can see what's going on. So I'll just work on one to make things a little simpler. First thing you might notice is the lens flare, or this element, brightness is already set to 0, and the way it actually appears is using the override options. So you can see that I've got a dynamic edge brightness set to 1. So as this flare reaches the edge of the screen, its brightness becomes 1 because this value gets added to this value by the point it reaches the edge of the screen. You can also see that I'm scaling up quite a lot. Some other options I've set while setting this up are in one of the rotation options is rotate to flare. So what this does, if you set this on, it'll always orientate the flare to the flare's origin. One of the other options is the element aspect ratio. By default, any element has a square aspect ratio, but it's quite simple just to change that by squashing it down. So 1:1 gives you a square aspect ratio. So I just squash that down, and that kind of gives you that shaft of light type effect. And with the combination of rotate to flare, gives you this streak-like effect. That covers the basics of dynamic triggering. If you have any questions, please get in touch either on the Unity forums or via email.